arrays per final gather point. Remember how I had said a little bit earlier that each dot or each light ray talks to other light rays within its section in order to understand how what color it should be and how strong or intense it should be. Well, you can control the number of various or different light rays that each individual light ray sort of talks to or speaks to gather data or information in here, rays per final gather point. So if we want our final gather point to talk to a great deal or a good number of rays, and we will go through tweaking these values without these points in a second, what you'll notice is before it even shows us our final gather points, you were already getting a lot smoother of a scene. Our shadows are a lot smoother. Now our scene itself is a little blown out. And just like we did with global illumination, it's a good idea to sort of turn down the strength of our light itself, just so our scene isn't so bright and we can see a little bit more of our finer gather points within our scene. Okay, so you can see I sort of dulled down the strength of the lighting a bit. Now the next section is we're going to interpolate between our over the number of final gather points. And what that does is if we have a very noisy scene, what we want to do is we want to increase the number of final gather points our scene sort of blends between. So with rays per final gather point, what it's doing is it's just talking to the other rays to get the lighting information. What we want to do is we want to tell it the number of rays that we want it to blend between. So if I jump this up to 100, it's going to look for 100 other points in order to blend the color information with. So as I go ahead and render that out, okay. Now what's happening? Now we have it where it's blending between 100 points. It's talking to 100 points, and we have a good deal more numbers of final gather rays, or a lot denser final gather rays being casted into our scene. But we're not getting actually a lot of light bouncing, and we can control the amount of bouncing within our scene with diffuse bounces. So if we want our light, now our light is just talking to other rays that are around it in the region. If we want our light to hit our surface and sort of, just like global illumination, bounce off and cast more of the energy on the other parts of the scene, we do that through diffuse bounces. So what you'll notice is if I set this to 1, and I'm going to go ahead and shut off my processing and enable visuals, because we got a good idea of what our light rays look like. And I'm going to go ahead and render that out. And what you're going to notice here is that I'm getting a lot more color spillage across my scene. And also what happens is when you increase the bounces in your scene, our lights actually reach out further. It's actually reaching the back of our wall and reaching into other areas. You can see that we have more of a scattering of color. I'm going to go ahead and pause this. So you can see that I'm getting a lot more color information here. And if I turn down my number of bounces and I render out my scene, what you're seeing is that my scene is not that intense. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set this to 1. And just like with global illumination, we have 2 multipliers. What we can do is we can control, our multiplier here controls the strength. So this is actually our weighting, which is also sort of considered a multiplier. But we have our overall multiplier, which controls all of the weighting within our scene. So if I go to 2, it'll double up all of the intensity of my final result. As you can see here, it intensified it by 2. And I can also increase the intensity or the weighting of the bounces that are coming off my various light rays. So if I set this back to 1 and I render that out, okay, so that's at 1, and I increase the weighting, I double up the weighting, or I'm sorry, weighting is the 1 is the maximum, but if I cut the weighting in half for the bouncing, what you'll notice is the strength of our bounces isn't as intense. So you can see here's our value. This is our weighting at 1. You're seeing a lot more of the color bleeding sort of happening, or the color reflection from our square. And here you're seeing it's a lot more diluted and it's not as strong within our scene. And it's just cut down by 0.5. and that's with our multiplier. In order to increase sort of render time, what we can do is we can have our final gather map right to a file. And the first time we go to render this out, it'll be the normal basic render time. So I'm going to go ahead and hit F9. Okay, F9, that sort of renders out our scene. And if we look at how long that sort of took us to render, now when I go to ahead and I render this out, you can see that my last render time took 32 seconds. When I go to render this out again, what you'll notice is it took 9 seconds for my last frame time to render. And that's because now what it's doing is it's rewriting, or it's writing, it's saved out the attributes for this, for the last settings of my final gather. So it's not recalculating all of the various settings, it's sort of saved them into this final gather map. So that's the various controls. And what you want to do in order to get a really nice render is you want to sort of play with the values that you learned from global illumination. So turning on global illumination with caustics, and play with sort of using your final gather more as a way of softening your scene, opposed to your primary rendering algorithm. So if you want to have a really nice and rendered scene with smooth shadows and stuff, use real actual reference, try to mimic and copy real reference, and play with these two values, which is your global illumination and your final gather.